My name is Kelly Perrin. I'm the Assistant Director at the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism, and I have the privilege today of announcing our speaker. But before I do that, I want to first I want to mention that Dr. Miller is the first speaker in the David Everett Post-Conflict Reconstruction Speaker Series, but I just want to alert you to the next one, so you can look forward to that too. On October 30th, we'll be having Beth Cole on campus, and the title of her talk is called Problem, World Disorder, Needed Guiding Principles for Stabilization and Reconstruction. Beth Cole, we are really lucky to be welcoming her to campus. She actually, she works for USAID, and in her capacity, she manages the relationship between USAID and the Department of Defense, which is, as you know, a really interesting and important relationship with all kinds of complexity. But on to Dr. Miller. I have abbreviated his CV and bio so that you can listen to him more than listen to me, but I will give you the brief synopsis to let you know that we are very, very lucky to have him here, and he's everything you could want in a speaker. He has a master's, a master's in public policy from Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School, which we've forgiven him for not. He got his PhD in international relations from Georgetown, which we're also forgiving him for. He is currently the associate director at the Clements Center for History, Strategy, and Statecraft at the University of Texas at Austin. But before that, he's had some really, really interesting career experiences, which I think you'll see inform his talk today. He was an adjunct political scientist at the RAND Corporation, director for Afghanistan on the National Security Council staff from September 2007 to September 2009 under both Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama, which has to be interesting. He's the assistant professor of international security and affairs at the National Defense University. And at one time, he served in Afghanistan as a military intelligence analyst with the Army. He's a prolific scholar, so he has the requisite long line of reports, articles, a couple of books, lots of commentary. Some of the titles to give you a flavor of his work, a book from last year, Armed State Building, some articles, 5 Pillars of American Grand Strategy, Getting to Negotiations in Syria, Democracy in Afghanistan. But today, the title of his talk to share with us is The Future of Stability Operations, Lessons from Afghanistan for Syria, Ukraine, and beyond. So, my pleasure.
Thank you, and thanks for coming out. I know this is not a class, you're not assigned to be here, so I appreciate your sacrifice of time in voluntarily coming to actually hear somebody talk about stability operations in Afghanistan and so forth. I appreciate that. I would like to do this somewhat interactively because I want you to think with me about a few issues. As mentioned, the title of my talk is The Future of Stability Operations. I really do want to talk about going forward, what may happen next in this field of stability ops, drawing from the recent past. And it's this relationship between the past and how we think about the past and the future that I want to kind of home in on at the beginning here. So I want to start by asking you a question. What are the lessons of Vietnam? What are the lessons of Vietnam? I want you to answer that. Actually, I want participation. It's not a rhetorical question. Tell me what you think the lessons of Vietnam are in a short, pithy phrase. Not a dissertation, not a paragraph, just a sentence or two. What do you think are the lessons of Vietnam? Yes?
One might be the necessity of tying political goals with military objectives.
Okay. You need political goals. Okay, what else? Just shout it out.
Read David Halberstam and believe about 90% of what he says.
Is he the one? I'm thinking Summers. Halberstam. What did he say? What did Halberstam say?
Revelation as an investigative reporter was that the government was getting sold a story by what was actually rather than what was on the ground in Vietnam.
So you need honesty in government.
Yeah, and truth. I guess a field. What do you call it? Truth. Truth. Grounding of your truth.
Got it. Okay, good. Thank you. Any other lessons of Vietnam that you can think of? Yes. Balance means with goals. Okay. There's a couple more I'm specifically hunting for. Keep going. Yeah.
This is not one you're looking for, probably, but strength of nationalism.
What about it? The Vietnamese nationalism was too much to overcome?
Sure,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
Have an exit strategy or
There, okay, all right, yeah. Need to have an exit strategy, okay. In this view of the war, this is the Summers view, it was an endless, indefinite, open-ended war. That was part of the problem. Right. And because we lacked a specific end state we wanted to get to,
there was no end game.
There was no end game. So it just lasted and lasted and lasted until we said, we got to get out of this thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is probably, again, not something you're looking for, but don't unlearn the lessons of like the kind of organizational military lessons of Vietnam in the next generation of war.
That's interesting. What particular lessons should we have not unlearned?
Maybe, I mean, I think at the tactical level, maybe the importance of captains in terms of ground forces.
Devolving decision-making.
Yeah, it took us a long time to learn that again in the first one.
Let me zero in on this. What is the opposite view? Anybody know? What is the kind of the opposite view of the war in Vietnam to this? All right. There's one school of thought that says we lost because it was an open-ended war with no defined end state. There's kind of another view, the Krepenevich view. Anybody know? Yes.
I don't know about another view, but I just wanted to say that, like, being supported by native people, like Vietnamese.
Importance of domestic support?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sure. That's absolutely true. Both within Vietnam and in the United States. Anybody else?
frequent one is don't micromanage the military.
Don't micromanage.
I think that's a false lesson, but it's a lesson in some.
Yeah, that's the next question is how many of these are true? Specifically, right, so this was, I think, one of the conventional views of Vietnam for a long time amongst scholars and policymakers and the American people. And then there was another view that's emerged more recently, I'd say in the 90s, that says actually one of the key lessons is, you know, we did too much conventional war. We should have done more counterinsurgency. We were actually getting there. We could have won. We just needed a bit more time. And so the very nature of it being open-ended was a good thing. It should have been more open-ended. And the fact that we had an artificially imposed withdrawal deadline, Nixon, the January 73 withdrawal, was a bad thing. Right? That's kind of the opposing view that's emerged more recently, which is essentially, how do you put that on a bumper sticker? It's do coin right, right? Okay. So there's this other view of Vietnam that we were getting there. We were actually kind of, you know, we were seeing local success from the Combined Action Platoon program, the Combined Action Companies, and the CORDS program, and the counterinsurgency was working. We just needed more time. Okay, so that's another view. Anybody, are you familiar with this? Anybody heard this view? It's actually more popular in the military. The military tends to believe this, and you know, I actually give it some credence myself. Okay, so what I want to note is, number one, how many lessons are on the board here? When I asked you what are the lessons of Vietnam, you came up with a list of like 8 or 10 things. That's interesting by itself to note how our interpretations of the past can be so varied, so different. We all have one kind of big thing called the war in Vietnam, and yet we've all interpreted it differently to come up with different lessons. In particular, there are at least 2 here that are very opposed to each other. There are radically different lessons that we can learn from Vietnam. One school of thought reads the Vietnam War one way and says the problem was this, we had no exit strategy, it was an open-ended conflict. And another school of thought reads it the exact opposite way, saying the open-endedness was good, we cut it off too early, we should have stayed, we were succeeding, we just needed more time. 2 very different lessons. And with these different lessons, how would you then, you know, if you all believed in lesson number 1, the problem is that we had no exit strategy. If you believe that, okay, pretend you believe that right now, how would that affect your beliefs about America's role in the world, the use of force abroad, and the prospects of conducting a protracted counterinsurgency in a foreign land in the future? How would that affect your beliefs when you're faced with, say, the war in Iraq, for example? How would that affect your beliefs about these things? Yes? Yeah.
Well, if I believed that an exit strategy was necessary, that would drive me to limit the goals that we're attempting to pursue.
Yeah. Yeah. It very much affects, I would say it makes you maybe more pessimistic, It makes you more constrained, more limited, makes you more hesitant about undertaking these kinds of interventions, sure. Okay. So now pretend you believe in the second lesson, that you believe that we're really actually kind of getting there, we were on the right track, counterinsurgency is doable, it's practicable, it was succeeding. If you believe that, how would that then affect your beliefs about the future, America's role in the world, the use of force, prospects of counterinsurgency, the war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan?
Offer that the goal in going to war is to end the war, but not necessarily end the relationship, especially maybe in terms of trade, ongoing trade and relationships, as well as when you shed blood, there's a very strange transference that goes on that you always own that blood. So, and there's a relationship that's started in the blood, you might say.
So this kind of view tries to take a longer perspective and understand that the interests will last longer than the war, the relationship will last longer than the war, longer term perspective.
But I also am trying to emphasize that being on someone else's ground is where you don't belong. And so counterinsurgency should be very respectful that I'm here as a guest.
All right. If you hold this perspective, I think your tendency would be to think that these kinds of interventions could be successful, and therefore it might actually be a viable policy option in the future if given the right circumstances. It's I want to say, a slightly more optimistic view, I think, of interventionism. The point of this whole exercise is to show that our beliefs about the past affect our behavior in the present and our expectations for the future. Our beliefs about the past crucially affect our behavior in the present and our expectations for the future. So how you interpret past American history, past American military history, past world history, affects your behavior in the current policy environment, facing the current challenges, and it affects what you think is a good idea and what you think is a bad idea for the future challenges. Obvious point, I hope. So now, what are the lessons of Vietnam? What are the lessons of Afghanistan? What are the lessons of Afghanistan? If this is the debate we've had about Vietnam for the last 40 years, we're now finally winding down the international project in Afghanistan. Do I have an eraser? And so we can start to have this discussion about the lessons of Afghanistan. This is actually one of the reasons that the international project in Afghanistan is important. It's important for counterterrorism and Pakistan stability and all that kind of stuff. But it's actually important as well for what it might teach the next generation of policymakers about America's role in the world, the use of force abroad, and the prospects for success of interventions of this type. Right? This challenge of Afghanistan is important because it's going to teach people to believe something, I don't know what, to believe something about these big important topics. And that means it will affect the decisions they make about the next crisis, and the next one, and the next one. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I want to ask you, but also I have my own answers, about the lessons of Afghanistan. So let's do the same exercise, real fast. What do you think are the lessons of Afghanistan? Sorry?
Oh, just said you could keep all of that up on the board, probably.
You probably could, actually. Just throw out a few ideas. A couple ideas. What are the lessons of Afghanistan? Did we win? Did we lose? Who thinks we won the war in Afghanistan? Who thinks we lost? Oh, come on. You can't all sit on the fence. Got to take a side. Anybody willing to take a side one way or the other?
Who's we?
Who's we? The United States.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, I could say NATO, ISAF. Yeah. Win? Okay. So there's one win.
I think there is no result yet.
Sorry?
There is no result yet.
There's no result yet. You can't tell. Too early to say. Like the French Revolution. Got it. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else want to take a side? Yeah.
The cost, in terms of the cost in blood, the war never win in terms of the cost of blood.
Yeah. Well, it's a good point. It could be a win, but a Pyrrhic victory, where the cost in terms of time, money, dollars, investment was so steep that even though if we achieved our objectives, it may not have been worth it. Okay, so you're not willing to take a side, win or lost, which probably is why you're not willing to tell me what the lessons are. Come on, give me some lessons of Afghanistan. Anything, yeah. Okay, more support of civilians, yeah. Sure. Anything else?
Culture, in terms of learning the culture, I don't think that was really organized well until like the third year we were there or something.
I think you're too generous to say the third year. I think it's more like the seventh. Yeah. But I agree with you. Yeah. Anything else?
Back as a leader.
Ah, interesting. No more need to be said, I think. Yeah. Any other lessons you want to suggest?
Should have a clearly defined end state.
Just like the last one. Yeah. End state. And it's not just clearly defined, because there actually was one in the Bush administration early on. It was something like this: Afghanistan shall be a stable, democratic, prosperous nation at peace with itself and its neighbors. You know, this very kind of, so it's not just end state, but also maybe achievable, realistic end state. Yeah. Anybody else want to suggest lessons? Okay, so you get, yes.
Not dealing very strictly with the warlords and war criminals. That's why the rule of law was not very much changed. And Afghanistan's relation with its neighbors, like in the region, like Pakistan's role in Afghanistan's future.
Yeah, regional approach, yeah. Okay. Okay, good. So once again, we're coming up with a longish list. I want to maybe take a step back. These are some fairly particular lessons, except for the end state one. Let me try to offer to you 3 interpretive frameworks that I think capture the kind of most likely interpretive lenses that future historians will use for the war in Afghanistan. 3 likely frameworks, or 3 broad lessons for the war in Afghanistan. I'm going to suggest them. I'm going to think through what each one means and analyze the pros and cons, and then try to take those 3 frameworks and apply them to sort of the future, you know, to the next crisis, to Syria, to Ukraine, or wherever there might be a next place. To illustrate how our beliefs about Afghanistan will affect our recommendations for Syria, for Iraq, or whatever's next. Okay, so let me offer 3 possible interpretive frameworks to the war in Afghanistan. First, some may look at the war in Afghanistan and say the war in Afghanistan is essentially a tragic failure. Right. In this view, we lost, and we lost because we tried the wrong stuff. Of course, it was right to go in. Nobody doubts that. We should have gone in and killed some bad guys. But everything we tried to do in Afghanistan besides attack al-Qaeda was just wrongly conceived from the beginning. We tried to do nation building. We tried to create a new government there. We tried to foster democracy in a land that's alien to democracy. We tried to create a centralized system of government. We tried to build their roads and schools and hospitals, and none of this was actually international interest. None of it was central to Afghanistan. None of it would stick in this broken country. This is wildly unrealistic. It was way too ambitious, and so this is a tragic failure. We tried the wrong thing, and you know, whether we would have succeeded in the stuff or failed in it, it was just the wrong stuff to try. So we were doomed to failure. It's like a Greek tragedy. All of our thinking, all of our planning, all of our strategy was wrong from the start. It was the tragic failure school of thought. Secondly, very much opposed to the tragic failure school of thought is those who argue that Afghanistan is a noble failure. This is embarrassing, but I always confuse noble with Nobel. I hope I got it right. The noble failure school of thought. They also agree that we basically failed, that we did not achieve in Afghanistan our goals, our most essential national security objectives, but we tried, and we were right to try. We gave it our best. We were right to try to foster democracy in Afghanistan, but we didn't succeed. You know, look at it today; it's a mess. They can't resolve their own presidential election. We were right to build roads, schools, and hospitals. We were right to try to mount a counterinsurgency campaign to defeat the Taliban. This was all a good, well-intentioned, strategically coherent approach. We just didn't implement it well. The problem was really coordination, management, resourcing, oversight. Maybe the problem was that the enemy just defeated us. The Taliban were too strong. It's the nationalist argument. For whatever reason, it was a rightly conceived strategy. We just failed. We didn't get it right. Third school of thought that I think is most likely, or of the three likely schools of thought, is that Afghanistan is actually an ugly success. An ugly success. And these are the only three, so note that I don't have a fourth on the board, which is victory. I don't think many people are going to look back on the international project in Afghanistan and say, we got it all right, and it was perfect, and it was good, it was a success. I don't think that's likely. And it kind of breaks my heart to say that, but I think it's true. Very few historians will look back and say, we got it all right. I think the most optimistic you can get is to say that in Afghanistan, we eventually got there. It's kind of like that school of thought in Vietnam. We were getting there. We were actually succeeding. We were learning. We were improving. Coin was right. We just ran out of time, ran out of support, and that's why it failed. This view says it took longer. It was more expensive. It was more difficult. It was more costly. But we actually eventually achieved our minimum national security goals. We denied safe haven to al-Qaeda. The government in Kabul exists. The Afghan army exists where no army existed 13 years ago. And this is sufficient. This is sufficient for our national security interests. It's sufficient to keep the homeland safe. It's actually sufficient even for rudimentary stability in South Asia. The insurgency is not going to spill over into Pakistan. It's not going to destabilize Pakistan. It's not going to erupt in massive civil war in Pakistan. Right. So this view, this school of thought says, we got close enough. We can call it a success. It was just pretty messy. It was more difficult, more costly, more lengthy than we expected it to be. So these are the three big schools of thought for interpreting the war in Afghanistan. Each of them would have very different subordinate lessons. In lesson one, the main lessons you would learn, if this is the kind of framework you're wearing, the belief system you have, the main lessons are do your strategy better at the beginning. Think more carefully about what your national interests really are. Be more deliberate about formulating your military policy and your intervention approach before you go there. Define your end states, define your goals, so you don't succumb to mission creep. Right? These are the main lessons if you're wearing hat number one. Be on guard against mission creep. In number two, if you're wearing hat number two, the lessons you're going to learn from the war in Afghanistan is it has to be adequately well-resourced. Any intervention, you need to kind of surge from day one. You need to give it the money, the troops, the time, the full support, the leadership, the faith from day one. And if you ever waver in that, you're risking failure. Your strategy was right, but you just need to kind of give it your all right away at the maximum from day one. One of the problems in Afghanistan, I think, is that for the first 5 years, it was radically under-resourced. There actually wasn't very many troops, wasn't a whole lot of money. And so that was, in my opinion, one of the problems early on in Afghanistan. So that would be the lessons if you're wearing hat number two. Hat number three, I think the lessons you would learn in this interpretive framework is essentially that you need to have realistic expectations going into an intervention about how long it takes, how difficult it might be, how much it will cost. Never promise to have the troops home by Christmas, because that's never true. Never promise that the failed state's going to pay for its own reconstruction, because that's never true either. You got to be grittily realistic about how hard, difficult, and long these things will be. And set your expectations low, and it will actually help you be pleasantly surprised when you might actually succeed 13 years down the line. Right. Those are the lessons in the third interpretive framework, if Afghanistan actually is an ugly success. Does this make sense? Sanity check? We all tracking? Anybody want to offer a fourth framework or a different lesson? Okay, good. So now if these are the three, yes?
Or something. Before it could be conditional or contextual success.
And how would that be different from ugly success?
Ugly success because within the context,
Okay. Oh, it's as good as we could have got it. Yeah.
In that context, regional, governance level, all the other kind of contingency.
Yeah, it's so hard that there's not a whole lot we could have done, and we basically did all that we could do.
Not so much so hard, but the context itself was so limiting.
Okay, the region. Okay.
I really believe there's a huge disconnect between the American public and executive leadership, probably for the last 20 years. And these wars therefore become executive wars in a lot of ways rather than the people's war. And that could change with civic, changing the whole civic tone. But to me, that's one of the biggest problems is we're having kind of permanent wars because we've got pointed fingers at many enemies.
And I agree, and you're so right that actually I think that might actually be true in all three frameworks. You know, I think that actually would be a key lesson, no matter how you interpret the war in Afghanistan. I think in any framework, you would recognize the need to sustain public support for this war or any other protracted war. Okay, so now the last kind of step in the argument is, and then we can do Q&A, is let's wear these hats one at a time and think about, what do you want to do first? Syria? Let's do Syria. Okay, so let's think about Syria. So think with me. Wear hat number one. Afghanistan is a tragic failure. We shouldn't have tried it in the first place. Let's all believe that for a second. Believing that, what is your policy recommendation for Syria? What should the United States do in Syria, knowing what we know about Afghanistan and what a mess it was, what a tragic failure it was? Leave it alone. Because we're terrible at this stuff. Why intervene when we just always fail and we always develop our own strategy? We just can't get it right. Failed in Vietnam, failed in Iraq, failed in Afghanistan. Syria, leave it alone. Okay, that is certainly one. There's actually people out there who say that, who say, IS is not a threat to us. Leave it alone. We shouldn't be involving ourselves again. Other recommendations? Wearing hat number one. Other ways of formulating this? Do you all agree that is the recommendation from framework number one? More or less?
The size of the military versus the size of the State Department, I think, is a real structural flaw. And what I'm getting at is if we had more people in the State Department, we could make better friends with the neighbors of Syria. And then when problems came up, we could talk to the neighbors, and the neighbors could talk to Syria.
A regional diplomatic approach. Sure. Yeah, so leave it alone. Maybe, actually, you would look at the president's speech last week where he said, we're gonna bomb, we're going to get regional allies, and we're going to train Iraqi security forces. You might actually think that's probably all we can do sufficiently. Right? Leave it alone, maybe bomb a little bit, and get some allies. Right? It's a fairly minimalist approach. It's not a very robust intervention. It's a fairly hands-off, and it's more of a offshore standoff attack, so to speak, to use some military parlance.
State Department resources.
No, I didn't say this was coherent or right. I said this is one way of approaching it. There are problems with this approach. Number one, how do you get the allies if you're not more engaged? Does this approach actually create lasting peace? Now, does this approach actually, is there an end? I mean, you complain about end states. Is there an end to this? We're just going to bomb bad guys forever. I think that there's practical and even moral problems with that. By saying, what this stance says, I think, effectively is the United States reserves the right to kill people it deems to be terrorists forever. Full stop. Right? We're just kind of never going to stop this. We're going to drone strike the world whenever we think a bad guy pops up who calls himself a terrorist, and that's how we're going to protect our national security interests. It solves no political problems. It changes no underlying conditions that fuel this kind of terrorism, and it's a very what's the word I'm looking for? Well, I mean, it's selfish, so to speak. You know, we only care about erecting a wall to protect ourselves physically, and the world can burn so long as we can lob drone strikes wherever we want. Right? That's I think, the effect of this. And the reliance on allies is kind of window dressing. Right? So you can tell that I am kind of critical of this approach. But I don't want to discount it. There are very serious policymakers, scholars who argue for this. In Afghanistan, this is Vice President Joe Biden's approach, right? he has argued we should do basically this in Afghanistan. That we should just sit there and bomb folks and not try to do anything else. Okay, let's move on, and let's all wear hat number 2. Let's pretend that we believe that Afghanistan was a noble failure. We actually tried the right thing, but it didn't work out because we didn't try hard enough. We didn't give enough money, enough time, enough troops, or enough whatever. We didn't manage, coordinate, oversee correctly, and so it essentially failed despite our best efforts. If that's what we believe, now what's our policy recommendation for Syria? Apparently none of you actually believe number 2 because you're having a hard time wrapping your heads around it. What would your policy recommendation be for Syria? Yeah. Go in big. So if we go big. Yeah. Or as I said, surge from day one. Yeah. So it is an if, like there's no certainty here that we would actually intervene in Syria, although the president did say last week we're going to start arming the rebels. That's an intervention of some kind. That's a pretty heavy thing. And so this framework, I think, would argue for a pretty big, pretty large, pretty robust, resource-intensive, lengthy, messy, huge, maybe roll in with the tanks, overthrow the government, impose our own system, a big thing. Yeah. There's a danger here. Okay, there's a joke. If you don't learn from the past, you're doomed to repeat it. But if you do learn from the past, you're doomed to make the opposite error. Right? I think Bob Jervis said that. And so if this is the lesson you've learned from the past, that it was a noble failure, the big danger is you're going to commit the opposite mistake and go in too big. Right? If you think that the problem in Afghanistan is we didn't do it enough, then the next intervention, you're likely to probably do too much. You're actually probably going to be predisposed to over-intervene in the next intervention. Right? That's kind of my suspicion, is that the school of thought, those who believe this, may make the opposite error the next time. Okay, third framework. Let's all pretend now, wear hat number 3, and pretend that we believe that Afghanistan is actually an ugly success. We achieved what we wanted. We actually got there. It was messy, costly, long, expensive, and hard, but we actually did win. We actually achieved our basic national security objectives, the best that we could in the conditions. So if that's our beliefs, now what is our recommendation for Syria? What do we believe about Syria? What do we believe about our ability to use force abroad? And how does it affect our recommendations for Syria?
You can go, but set realistic expectations as you're going into it for your strategy. So, don't put out false deadlines that you can't possibly achieve, or try and make sure that the public that you're driving your power from is actually going to understand what's fully being committed in that endeavor.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's about right. Yeah. We can go in, because actually the war in Afghanistan showed we can use the tools of national power effectively. We actually achieved our objectives. Therefore, we could do it again in Syria. We could use the same tools, military strikes, diplomacy, some reconstruction assistance if available, if we can actually do it in Syria. But you're right, yeah, we need to be realistic about what this is going to look like. It's going to be messy. Success, if it ever comes, isn't going to look tidy. It's not going to come wrapped in a bow, and it's not going to look like Belgium or something like that, And pay attention to public support, because these things last and last and last forever, and you can't have a protracted campaign like that unless you have public support.
Humility would help. I mean, we know so little about some of these countries in terms of their culture. I mean, in terms of the business we do with Syria, even business relationships, yeah. and international educational exchanges, Syria and the U.S. I mean, you're talking about non-existent realities.
We always need to be humble, and once we achieve that, we need to go around the world telling everybody we're the most humble country in the world. That's what America would probably do. Okay, so this is a good exercise, right? We all thought about Afghanistan, thought about how it might be interpreted, and thought about how those different interpretations could affect our recommendations for policy towards Syria. And of course, we could do the same exercise for any other failed state through Iraq again, North Korea, Mali, Somalia, Congo. Pick your failed state. We could go through the same exercise. Now, the purpose is not to be purely subjective and say, well, we just don't know. There's no truth, right? I don't believe that at all. I'm not postmodernist. I have my own opinions about Afghanistan, my own well-informed, educated opinions about Afghanistan based upon research, where I think that this is essentially wrong. I think number one, it's just wrong. I think it misinterprets it. That's my own judgment. Form your own. But I think it's wrong. It doesn't fit the facts, doesn't fit the data. I think we actually tried this approach for 5 or 6 years in Afghanistan. We actually did kind of leave Afghanistan alone. We paid attention to Iraq. We did the just bomb them approach in Afghanistan for 5 or 6 years. We had no really strategy for reconstruction, stabilization, or humanitarian assistance or anything like that. We gave it very little money. We tend to forget that now because we know what came later. We gave it a lot more money later on, but it was precisely during the time frame when we were doing this that the Taliban insurgency started. And the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were resurgent in South Asia. So I think that number one is just a false interpretation. It is wrong. It is incorrect. And therefore, I think that these lessons are wrong, and they would be the wrong lessons to apply to the future of stability operations. Right? If we think about the future of stability operations, my judgment is we should not take these lessons and apply them to the future. I'm torn, I have to confess, I'm torn between these two because we don't know how Afghanistan's going to turn out. We really don't. I think it kind of hangs in the balance right now. I wish I could predict the future. People ask me all the time, you studied Afghanistan for 13 years, what's going to happen next? And I say, I don't know. I can't predict the future. I think a lot depends upon the choices we make in how we withdraw. It was very surprising to me when the president announced in May that we're actually going to pull down to 0 troops by the end of 2016. I actually thought we were on a different track. I thought we were going to stay there for 10 years. And I think that really is an important variable, and it could tip the balance between these two. We might be on track for an ugly success if we kind of keep with it. This is my judgment. If we keep with it, we might actually be able to kind of roughly get to what we were hoping for all those years ago. But I think if we give up now, it makes it more likely that we're going to end up in something like that. It makes it more likely that the Taliban will be resurgent, more likely there will be civil war in Afghanistan, more likely that what's happened in Iraq recently will recur in Afghanistan with the Islamic State resurgent, taking territory, beheading people. I think we may actually see that in Afghanistan in about 3, 4, 5 years, if indeed the United States pulls out completely. So my view is we're right on the edge here in Afghanistan, and that makes me a little uncertain about the future of stability operations. Because the whole world is going through this exercise. The entire community of people who care about post-conflict reconstruction stabilization, they are all going through this exercise right now regarding both Afghanistan and Iraq. And they're thinking to themselves, okay, if Iraq was essentially a failure, I think that's probably true, and Afghanistan, we don't know yet. Okay, what does that mean for our next intervention? I sense there's quite a lot of skepticism about the prospects for intervening at all, anywhere. There's a reason why we have not intervened in Syria. There's a reason why the United States stayed out of Mali, left it to the French and the UN. There's a reason why our intervention in Somalia for 2.5 decades has been a very light footprint. And our intervention in Somalia has basically been this. Let's bomb some bad guys, let's help Ethiopia overthrow a government, and then just walk away. Our intervention in Libya was this. It was, we're going to overthrow a government and then do nothing else. I mean, there was the lessons we apparently learned from Iraq was don't go in with any kind of a post-war anything. And so we overthrew a government, and today Libya is overrun with militias. It's in a state of essentially civil war. I think Libya is a failure. There was no post-conflict reconstruction. There was a regime change followed by nothing. So I look at the future of stability operations a little bit pessimistically. I think that a lot of folks are hesitant to go in, skeptical of the prospects for success of any kind of intervention, and yet they do recognize if ever we go in, we're going to go in this way. We're going to go in big, without deadlines. We're going to go in realistic expectations, that kind of thing, which is the silver lining on this cloud. If stability operations is, if people are skeptical about it, at least I think we probably are learning a few of these key lessons for whenever there is a next time, and there will be a next time.
For the policymakers or decision makers that perhaps agree with you or are trying to decide between 2 and 3, if they think that public perception is at 1, that it was just a tragic failure, I mean, even if they think there was progress, they'd have a hard time justifying the public to go in and go big. even if they thought it was right, right?
That's the job of statesmen and leaders is to exercise that persuasive function, right? And I've been amazed to see the abrupt change in public sentiment in just the last few weeks regarding Iraq. If you had asked me just a month ago, 2 months ago, will the United States be re-engaged militarily in Iraq, I would have laughed at you and said, there's no way. And yet, pretty abruptly, people are supporting at least this strategy. It's not much, but at least they're supporting that. There's a bipartisan consensus, strong public support for it. So public opinion can change given certain conditions. And there's a whole other question about why did we decide to go into Iraq again? A whole other question, but public opinion can change. And I think the president was actually very deliberate about trying to lead that change and persuade people this is important enough to re-engage.
Do you see any successes by any other country or the US in the world that you would point to and say?
In any reconstruction?
Yeah, in any.
Absolutely. Yeah. Looking at the whole history of, and if there's one error in this, it is over-interpreting one data point or two data points, Iraq and Afghanistan. There's actually a large universe of cases of post-conflict reconstruction stabilization. And overall, we are getting better. We are learning how to improve our performance in these kind of operations. Iraq and Afghanistan loom so large in public debate that I think that they will be essentially determinative in our attitude towards future stability operations. But I think that's an intellectual error. I think we should consult the broader universe of cases. Namibia, Mozambique, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Bosnia, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, East Timor are all more or less successes. I'm not saying these are pleasant places to live, but I think that they succeeded in what they were trying to achieve. Some of them were ugly successes, but they were successful enough that I'm confident in saying we can succeed when we get it right. Like, it's not impossible to succeed. It's not impossible.
Kosovo was a go in there and bomb some bad guys, but what else made it
afterwards,
better?
We occupied, the UN ran Kosovo for several years. There was quite a bit of money for reconstruction assistance afterwards. It wasn't entirely bomb and forget. It was bomb followed through with a pretty robust mission afterwards, in my reading of it. Yeah.
Well, which is the ugly success strategy is nice, but there is this fundamental problem with resources, which is that sustaining political will to keep the trickle of resources from drying up over the time period that you need. So that's one question. How do you ensure the political will to keep this going long enough to see it through? But the other is, if you're going to go on the if we go big strategy, well, what would you call Iraq?
The first time around?
Well, which was the first time around, 91 or 2003?
Yeah, really, the second. Who's counting? Yeah. Okay, so one at a time.
Because one might argue that 2003 was go big, and then
no, it
turned out
absolutely
so
was
well.
go big. Yeah. Well, no, not really, in some ways. Okay, what was your first question?
Resources.
Resources. How do you sustain public support to sustain the resources? I think the answer is probably only do it when your national interests are at stake. Because public opinion can be fickle, because it can change, and because the American people love humanitarian interventions until they don't. So what they do love is protection. And so going in when your national interests are at stake is a great way of ensuring the public will support it for the long term. Or until they get tired of it. Well, yeah. I mean, Afghanistan is kind of remarkable. People keep saying, could we really sustain the public support? Well, we have. 13 years is like one of the longest interventions ever. So we actually have demonstrated political will, political resolve, and that's a remarkable story in and of itself. Sometimes when I make this argument, people ask me, why do you like interventions? I don't like them. They're expensive and hard and messy, and they kill people. I think that they are an effective tool that we should have the capability to do when necessary. And it is not often necessary to do this. It is not often necessary to mount an intervention like this. So I don't go around advocating intervention at every occasion. There are some policymakers who do, but I don't. I think that we should reserve them for when they're necessary, and when they're necessary, the public is more likely to support them. Okay, your second question, what about Iraq? We went in big for the regime change, but not much else afterwards. As famously, there was no plan for post-conflict reconstruction. Right. We gave back sovereignty after a year. And honestly, in that circumstance, that might have been a mistake. It might have actually been more, I know, it might have been more effective to have this. I mean, look, we ruled West Germany for 4 years, for 10 years actually, for 10 years. So it might have been more. You said we threw money at it. Yes, we did, but we actually wasted a lot of money. We might have been able to get more use, more bang out of the buck if we had retained sovereignty in the CPA for a while. Maybe. Totally speculative. I would say that we went in light in our, again, the lack of plans is where we were light. You know, throwing troops and money is part of the footprint, but not having a current plan for how to use them really matters. The looting, you know, although we had 100,000 troops there, they didn't stop the looting, so we actually didn't have a heavy security presence. It's not just the numbers, it's how you use them. And we were not using them for peacekeeping in the aftermath of the fall of Baghdad. And so our security presence was effectively a light footprint. Does that make sense? I know, calling 100,000 troops a light footprint is a little bit odd, but we were not upholding law and order in Iraq. If we had upheld law and order in Iraq with our 100,000 troops, that would have made a big difference. That would have prevented a lot of the bad stuff that came along. I'm seeing skeptical looks, but that's okay.
The problem with Iraq is that you can go back and say, if we hadn't done this, and if we hadn't done this, and if we hadn't done this, it would have turned out better. Yeah. But there's a long succession of the first couple months of those things.
Yes, because we made a lot of mistakes. But I say this kind of thinking is inevitable. We always inevitably learn lessons from history. They're not always the right ones, and they're not always well informed, but I think consciously or subconsciously, we all have beliefs about Iraq and Afghanistan, and those beliefs will shape how we think about the future of stability ops, future of America's role in the world, et cetera. And so we all go through that thought process, whether it's rigorous or not, we all do it. And so I would just argue we need to do it carefully and thoughtfully. Here and then there.
Rigor. I mean, are the cases of Iraq and Afghanistan looming too large in your analysis such that they're kind of creating these templates, and do these templates hold across cases, you know, for the U.S., for the international community /UN, for the historical kind of trajectory of this kind of research? I mean, you mentioned already the cases of, you know, Reconstruction that were quite effective. I mean, what separates them, and how do those cases fit into this kind of template? You know, and related to that, you know, the data. I mean, I think of the Sigar and Sigir reports, you know, the special inspector reports on Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, there's lots of really interesting information there to mine that would say something specific across sectors in Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, how did governance go in relationship to military? How did military go in relationship to police? How did civil society go in relationship to, you know, local government? I mean,
and this was the subject of my last talk, was kind of trying to disaggregate success and failure across different fields and sectors. I'm pulling out to a vast level of generality now. And I totally agree with you that Iraq and Afghanistan shouldn't be the only cases we consult. And this is the subject of my book, was to look at 40 cases and try to extrapolate lessons learned from that whole universe of cases and think more intelligently about the future. But the fact is we probably won't do that. You know, this is more about how we actually will be thinking about the past and therefore the future. I know, it's terrible. I hate to say that, but I think it's true that we, as a society, as a policy-making elite, will tend to make this error of overemphasizing Iraq and Afghanistan. I think we will. We're always fighting the last war, as the cliche goes. So this exercise is more descriptive than prescriptive, kind of.
I mean, the last word is Yemen, right? I mean, so how does that kind of, you know?
The president, in his speech, specifically cited Yemen and Somalia as the templates of success he wanted to follow in this next war in Iraq, the third one, I guess, which is interesting. So now he's invoking the past. He's invoking a template and saying, this is our model of success we're going to follow. I think calling Somalia a success is highly problematic.
I just had a question on your application of the term failed state when applying any of these frameworks or models that I may have misunderstood, but it sounded like you were calling North Korea and Mali both failed states. And I'm I just wondered what your assumptions were about failed states that you would categorize both North Korea and Mali as failed states.
Yeah, I have two answers. One is you should have come to my last talk, and number two, you should read my book. Yeah, I totally agree with you. A large part of my past presentation was disaggregating this concept of failed state. I think it's not useful to think of one thing called a failed state. There's actually lots of different kinds of failed states. Mali has failed because of a civil war and a lack of governance. North Korea, I think I call it failed because it's essentially a barbaric regime. It's totalitarian, and it's starving its own people. So it's very different kinds of failure. I totally agree with you. And therefore, we should intervene with different strategies. If we ever intervene, we should intervene with different strategies. Yeah.
You started with Vietnam, and we went to Afghanistan and Iraq, but where does World War II fit in here? Because we see, I guess, a different construct. And instead of doing your bombs and allies or go big, you see a construct that requires either attrition or annihilation, and then going big in reconstruction. Whether it's the Marshall Plan or taking over Japan until they're ready to stand on their own 2 feet. Yeah. That seems like another viable method. Maybe we get caught up on the political viability of attriting or annihilating a certain country.
How do I answer that? I mean, why did I focus on Afghanistan? Because it was the subject of today's talk. Because it's the recent past, and because that's what we are cognitively predisposed to focus on. There's a recency bias, I think, built into how we think. We always think about the immediate past. Are there lessons we could have learned from post-World War II occupations? Yes. Again, read my book. There are some, although it's so some people say, hey, we did it in Germany, we could have done it in Afghanistan. Well, they're actually very different cases. So does that mean it's irrelevant? No, it's not irrelevant, but it means you have to be very careful about how you extract lessons from Germany to apply them to Afghanistan or Syria. Since there was no insurgency in Germany, we didn't need to adopt a counterinsurgency strategy in Germany. Kind of an obvious point, but therefore it does limit its direct applicability to Afghanistan. Nonetheless, I think there are some lessons to be learned about how robust of a occupation we mounted in Germany. It was far more than even in Iraq. So we should learn lessons from the ancient past. We absolutely should. This is more descriptive than prescriptive. This is a kind of a prediction of how historians will treat this and how policymakers will treat it. I would love to see people read more on World War II and on the Peloponnesian War, and absolutely steep yourselves in history. Somebody said it's vicarious wisdom. When you read history, you are benefiting from the mistakes everybody else has made. So you can make new ones.
Just a follow-up. How much of an antecedent to successful post-conflict reconstruction does there need to be destruction or complete surrender before?
The right answer is it depends. In Haiti, zero. We don't need to destroy anything in Haiti. Right? If we're going to intervene in Haiti, and we actually are intervening in Haiti right now, we don't need to destroy anything. We need to build stuff. If we're going to intervene in North Korea, we need to destroy everything. Right? We need to overthrow that government. We need to do a war crimes tribunal. We need to, really wreck some stuff before we would mount a reconstruction operation in North Korea. So it entirely depends. In Syria and Iraq, I think in Syria we would need to wreck a lot of stuff. Iraq, not sure. So I know there's this view, especially in the military, that you just have to defeat your enemy as thoroughly as possible and break their will and bomb their cultural sites and churches and stuff. It's the William Sherman, the March to the Sea. You need to burn the entire country to the ground, and that's what will make a successful reconstruction operation later. I think that attaches too much importance to that one variable. I think it really depends upon the war you're fighting. Some interventions don't require that. Some do, but not always. Thankfully, not always.
Well, keep on your desk a copy of the U.S. Institutes of Peace Reconstruction and Stabilization Handbook?
No, but I keep it on my computer.
That was like 2007, was it? Or?
Yeah, the State Department and USAID have put together quite a lot of materials in the last decade. Their interagency conflict assessment framework, their reconstruction stabilization manual. There's even an interagency doctrine for this stuff, and it's an improvement. It's better than nothing. I think there is some tendency to search for a template, to search for a sequence, to search for the master plan that you can just slap down in every country. I think that's probably wrong. because different states fail in different ways, and there is no template, there is no master sequence. So I'm a little bit wary of some of the stuff, but I'm glad to see there's careful thinking in the interagency about this. Yes?
How could policing makers in the United States decide when it's necessary to intervene in other states? And like, who's necessary is like all those interventions? I mean, like, is it necessary from both U.S. or is it necessary from the states in conflict?
You're asking how do we decide when to intervene?
Yeah.
You got another hour? Great question. The short answer is it depends a lot on the president who's in office. Not every failed state's a threat to the United States. Boy, how do I even begin to answer that succinctly? Once again, it depends. So I would answer it one way if you're asking for a description for how does it actually happen. Right? How did President Obama decide to intervene in Libya? Well, I think he actually does care about humanitarian ideals quite a lot. He said so in his Nobel Prize speech in 2009. He intervened in Libya explicitly for that purpose in 2011, in Iraq in 2014. I think his action was triggered because of the threat to the Yazidis. I think he really cares about the humanitarian ideals. President Bush, I think, is a very different calculation. I think he genuinely believed that America was under threat by Iraq and its WMD, supposed WMD. He really genuinely believed that there was a terrorist connection there. So a different calculation. Now, if you're asking me, what do I think it should look like, it's a very different answer. The first answer is have a grand strategy, which would be nice, which we haven't had for a long time. And then from your grand strategy, you can understand your priorities in the world, and you can understand where interventions are necessary and where they are not necessary. I'm actually not convinced that we need to do a whole lot in Iraq and Syria right now. I'm a little undecided on this, but I'm not convinced it is as big of a threat to the United States as Afghanistan and Pakistan are. I actually think South Asia is a more important region to the United States and the world than the Middle East. That's heresy in policy circles, but I think it's true. So have a grand strategy is the answer. That's how you can decide. Sorry, I can't give you a more satisfactory answer.
One more question. Why President Obama was moved by the threat posed to Yazidis in Iraq, but not to the threat posed to Christians in Iraq? That just happened 1 month before. So why did he decide to strike?
I'm serious. Is there any way we can do it?
Why don't we take a minute to thank our speaker?
Yeah.
And then we'll...
Yeah. Then I'll give you the real answer.
We'll do that, right? All right, please join me in thanking